The year is 2063. The sun is beating down. All of the rich people have taken all the water. I look out to the ocean. There's dangerous critters out there. And also the ocean is kind of spooky. I run away, but then I realized I'm very thirsty. Maybe this salt water could quench my thirst. I collect it in a bottle. I'm very excited about this. As I walk away, I think about, will this taste good? Maybe it will. I'm so thirsty. Delicious. I love seawater. That tastes so good. So it doesn't actually taste very good, and you'll die if you just drink seawater. Yep, it's very salty, and your kidneys are like, oh wow, that's a lot of salt. We better get rid of some of that. Let's use some water, and you can pee it out. However, you're drinking more salt water to get more water to get rid of the salt, but you're putting more salt into yourself. Oh my gosh, it's a never-ending cycle. You end up dehydrating yourself and you'll die. So don't just drink seawater. Not good. But the thing is, the Earth, there's a lot of seawater here. 97% of all the water on Earth is seawater, salty. So that really doesn't leave much for all of us to drink or put on crops. Water the garden, and of the 3% left that's fresh water, most of it's trapped in glaciers, frozen. So there's really only 0.5 of the total water available on Earth that we can actually use. Wow, it's not very much, is it? No. Did you know about 2 billion people, so that's 1 in 3 people on Earth, don't have access to clean drinking water. So that's quite unfortunate. We've got all this salty water from the sea. Surely we can just turn that into some drinking water, right? There's got to be a way to do that. Is there? Maybe? Oh yeah, there is. It's called desalination. And the title of this video. So what is desalination? It's literally just the process of removing salt from seawater to turn it into clean water to drink or to use for other things people use water for. Brilliant. So how do they actually do this desalination thing? So there's 2 main ways that they achieve this magical thing of turning seawater into fresh water. So the first way seems like the most obvious way to me. This is kind of what I imagined that they were doing. I didn't really put too much thought into it, but I'm like, oh yeah, this kind of makes sense. So the first way is through distillation. Oh yes, a chemistry thing. I've done some distillations in my time. Okay, so the process of distillation, you take some seawater in, I don't know, whatever container they have it in. Then you heat up that seawater to over the boiling point of water, so over 100 degrees. It turns into steam. It comes up and it goes through some condensing things, so the steam's traveling along and then it'll get condensed with a cooler thing and then it'll turn back into a liquid water and then you can capture it on the other side. The magic thing is that only the water is evaporating, so you're going to get clean, fresh drinking water on the other side once it's condensed, and all the salt and other gross things, bacteria that's in the seawater and whatnot, that's going to be left behind because that's not going to boil off. Salt seems pretty stable to me. You're going to have to use a lot more energy to turn salt into a gas. So the salt all stays behind and then you get the clean drinking water. However, this is not the most common way that desalination actually occurs out in the real world. Interesting. So why is that? Well, we said you got to heat the water up to its boiling point. See water right here? You've got O and then 2 H's, H2O. H2O just add water. So you got oxygens, you got some hydrogens, and when it's a liquid, these molecules of H2O come together, they form these hydrogen bonding networks, and hydrogen bonds are a very strong type of bond because there's a large difference in electronegativity between oxygen and hydrogen. So very strong bonds, takes a lot of energy to break the bonds between the H2O molecules. Therefore, it requires a lot of energy to turn liquid water into water that's a gas or steam. So this is why the boiling point of water is so high, and unfortunately in this distillation process, you have to boil off the water, so you need to put in a lot of energy to do this, and therefore it's very expensive. So there's other types that might be a bit better, cheaper, less energy. Okay, what is it? So this other type of desalination is by far the most popular type of desalination which occurs out in the world. Accounts for maybe 60% of all desalination plants use this method. Now, the original idea came from this guy called Sir Francis Bacon. What a sick name. So he was back in the 1600s. He's like, oh, look at all the salt water we have that we can't drink. What if we just filtered it through some sand to get rid of the salt and be left with clean water? It didn't work, but like the idea was there and he had a cool name, so like that's fun. But the concept that Sir Bacon was thinking about when he said that you'd take some salt water, pass it through some like membrane or like filter and result in clean drinking water, this idea was developed upon by some scientists, and then in the 1960s they finally have an operational plant which uses this technique. And what is this technique? It's called reverse osmosis. Ooh, sounds very fancy, doesn't it? So before we go through what the second desalination technique is, we first probably need to understand what osmosis is before we talk about reverse osmosis. And how are we going to learn about osmosis? Through an experiment. Woo! Exciting, an experiment. So yeah, enjoy that. Oh, hey everyone, welcome to the experiment. We're going to be using potatoes to figure out what osmosis is. And yep, I'm lining up that potato. So what I'm going to do is I've got this potato here, I'm going to outline it with a pen so we know exactly how big this potato is. We're going to measure 3 different potato sizes, doesn't really matter their starting size, but there we go. Wow, that's a potato outline. And as you can see on the bench here, on the left in the beaker, we've got some clean tap water. In the middle, in the conical, we've got the seawater collected earlier. And on the right, I've got some salt that I dissolved in some water. So we've got these 3 different solutions, and we're going to put the potato in each of these different solutions, and we're going to see what happens. So my hypothesis is that the potato size in the clean water, hopefully that would get bigger. And in the saltier water, I hope the potato might get smaller. Why? Because osmosis. So osmosis says if there's water separated by a membrane, the water that has a lower concentration is going to want to travel towards where the water with the high concentration is. And using potatoes as the membrane, the water inside the potato, hopefully when you put it in saltier water, it's going to want to zoom out from the potato into the saltier water, because the saltier water is more concentrated. And therefore, putting it in the tap water, the clean water, there's probably more concentration of salt just in the potato, so the tap water will zoom in to the potato and the potato will get bigger. Is it going to work? Who knows? Let's measure and see if the potatoes have grown or shrunk. Alright, let's have a look. Wow, it was actually successful. We got an increase in size for the clean water and a decreasing size for the 2 saltier waters. Hope you enjoyed the experiment. There was, potatoes. I haven't done it yet. So it might have worked, it might have not. But that's science. But what's important is that we learnt something from it. Now we've learnt what osmosis is. Okay, cool. So what's this got to do with desalination? So we found out that water wants to travel from fresh water, low concentration, to seawater, high concentration of salt. So you've got seawater sitting on one side, and you've got clean water sitting on the other side of this membrane. It's not going to be very good for desalination. Clean water's just going to want to get pulled towards the salt water, and then you're not going to get any clean water out. Okay, so how do we get it to go the other way? We want to be able to push salt water through the membrane and get clean water to come out the other side. Well, that is where reverse osmosis comes in. Ooh, cool. So obviously, it's not going to do the reverse osmosis by itself, because it wants to just, do its regular osmosis. So to force the seawater to go through the membrane and to push clean water out the other side, you have to overcome the osmotic pressure, which is pretty much just the pressure of osmosis, which is pushing the water back the other way. So to do this, you need to put energy into the system. They use very high pressure pumps to pressurize the seawater coming in, to force it across the other side and produce clean water. Very cool. So there's 5 steps to this reverse osmosis desalination process, and let's go through them. Let's see what happens, because it sounds pretty cool, pretty fun. Okay, step 1. They need the ocean, because that's where they get the seawater from. So yes, they need a way of intaking some seawater to bring it into the plant to begin with. This is not as easy as it might seem. First of all, sucking in a whole lot of seawater, you might suck in some fish. Oh no. To avoid sucking in some fish, they put some grates over these intake pipes. But it's still possible that some little things that you don't want to get sucked in can still get sucked in. So this brings about one cool innovation. Instead of just having a pipe in the ocean that you're sucking a whole lot of stuff in, you can have the pipe going down into the sand and suck the water from beneath the ground and through the sand. And therefore, you're using nature, the sand, as a filtering device where you suck in the water. So you're not going to get any fish getting stuck in here. And you're also filtering it out quite a lot of the other gross stuff that you don't want in your pipes. So now we've got the seawater in there. The next step is the pre-treatment process. Now, they can't just shoot the seawater straight through a membrane. Nope, they need to pre-treat it first. And there's actually a lot of steps that are involved in this pre-treatment process. So some of the main things that happen in this pre-treatment process, they can add chlorine to the water, and this helps disinfect and kill any of the bacteria or microbes. So on top of that, they can do some coagulation. So that's going to help bind together a bunch of small particles that are floating around and form some bigger ones, and they can settle out. Flocculation. And they can also pass the water through some filters. Maybe a microfilter, an ultra filter. So the good thing about drawing water up through the sand, like we said before, instead of sucking in fish from the ocean, is that there's a lot less pre-treatment steps needed if you already suck it through the sand, because that's already doing a lot of the filtering for you. So there's a lot of benefits to sucking it up through the sand. I guess you have to build down into sand though, as opposed to just having a pipe. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of things they can do, and this is before that the seawater ever reaches the membrane where the reverse osmosis happens. Okay, now the water's been pre-treated. It's pretty clean. It's ready to become desaltified. First, it needs to go through some high pressure pumps, because the pressure of the water needs to be greater than the osmotic pressure that's pushing it back the other way. There's an equation here. You can determine the flow of the water out the other end by looking at the difference in the pressures of the seawater coming in and the osmotic pressure. So you got to have a greater pressure. So these high pressure pumps is where the majority of the energy consumption comes from. A way to reduce the energy consumption and make this more efficient is to use an energy recovery system. And some places have decided to do this. Very good idea. How does it work? Well, there's a bunch of different ways, but one way is taking the waste stream that comes out, and instead of just shooting that away, you could use the pressure of that waste stream, which is still pressurized from before, to repressure and take most of that energy and repressure some of the water coming back in. So it, can come around in a bit of a cycle and use the energy that you've already put into it. So you can recover some energy, and therefore this makes it a more efficient process and cheaper, using less power and better all round. So that's a fun little invention and very nice. So now we've done all these steps. We've got the water from the sea. We've treated it. Now we've pressurized it really high. We finally reach the membrane, and this is where the reverse osmosis happens. So what is this membrane made of? Good question. It's not just a sieve. That would probably not be very helpful. Probably let a lot of stuff through. Wouldn't let the fish through though. These membranes are polyamide thin film composites, or TFC for short, and it's very thin, maybe 0.2 microns, little thin boy. This is sitting on some support stuff, but it's just that thin little sheet that's doing all of the filtering out the salt. Very cool. How does it do this? A little bit of a mystery, but the main thing is water is quite small, probably about 0.3 nanometers, just a little water molecule. Salt, sodium chloride, other things that could be dissolved in the water as well, they're obviously a bit bigger. So the pores that are in this polyamide barrier are very tiny pores, not pores, pores with a no. This can lead the water through, but it stops anything bigger, like salt or other things, from getting through. So that gets just stopped, and the water can come through. There's also other factors that come into it, such as maybe the charge that's on the surface of this polyamide barrier, so that can interact with the charges on the ions that are in salt. That also helps to stop the salt from coming through, and just lets the water swim on straight through. There's another equation that determines the flow of the water through. This one here. A lot of fun terms that doesn't really matter. But if you look at the D here, that is the thickness of the membrane. This equation says the thinner the membrane, the better the flow of the water will be. So there's been a lot of research recently looking at trying to make these membranes even thinner, but still stopping the salt, but letting the water come through. So some ideas have been graphene, which is like a 2D sheet of carbon. That's a cool thing. Or graphene oxide, or other things like molybdenum disulfide. So all these 2D materials that are like, technically you can have an atom thin because they're in a 2D sheet and the width is just one atom, so very thin, which is very good. It's going to be difficult getting one layer, so you have to use some sort of fancy way to put this thin layer on. But if they can do that, then you can have a really thin barrier, and by designing your materials, you could use chemistry and change the material so you can like optimize how big the holes are, so you can be like, what do I want to let through? Probably just water, so you can make them real small. So there's one main problem that occurs at the membrane, which is called membrane fouling. So this is pretty much just a whole lot of gross stuff getting stuck to the membrane, because like the seawater's coming in, the clean water's coming out. There's a bunch of gross stuff in the seawater, and that's just going to get stuck to the membrane. There's a bunch of different things that could get like stuck on the membrane: inorganic matter, organic matter, biological things. And this is obviously going to decrease the effectiveness of the membrane because there's like stuff stuck to it, so less water can get through. So how do they combat this? They can add more steps to the pre-treatment process that'll help get rid of more of the gross stuff that's going to be stuck to the membrane before it even reaches the membrane. Or they have to wash the membrane, which is probably quite difficult. Probably have to turn off the pumps, unless you want to get like splashed in the face with seawater. Probably not the vibe. Or you can develop your membrane technology to reduce the amount of membrane fouling that occurs in the first place. A fun example is you can attach these silver nanoparticles to the polyamide membrane, and this can help stop some of the bacterial fouling because silver nanoparticles are quite antimicrobial, can destroy DNA with like chemistry and magic and stuff. So if you attach those to the membrane, you can help reduce the amount of bacteria that get stuck to the wall. Very cool. Wow, amazing. You've done it. You've pushed the seawater through the membrane, and now we have fresh, clean water. Incredible. Is the job over? Nope. No, it's not. Because what is left behind? All of that salt. And what are you going to do with all that salt? It's a very good question. So the efficiency of these desalination plants is around like 50-ish%. So when you take an X amount of seawater, you're only going to get half the amount of clean water out. And the rest is like a concentrated brine solution. So just a very salty solution because it's got all the salt that didn't come through, and obviously you're not going to get all of the water as well coming through. So delicious. You've got this very salty solution. What you going to do with it? So this can get pumped out the side, go to the energy recovery system, which helps transfer some of the energy of the pressurized brine into the incoming seawater. So that helps. But now you've got this brine. Where are you going to put it? Dump it back into the ocean? Probably not a good idea. The brine's going to come into the water, it's going to be more dense, it's going to sink to the bottom, and any of these little critters or fish or whatever, they're going to be having a real salty time and probably die. So you don't want to do that. So you can disperse this over a large area, so that kind of decreases the concentration that you'll see over a large area. So that's one way of doing it. You can pump it into the ground. It's another way. I don't know, you could sell it. Do people want to buy brine? I don't. Maybe you do. Or another way to get rid of it is you can mix it with like maybe a power plants nearby, and they've got some water coming out that they've used, and you can mix it together and it's less concentrated, and then you can put that in the ocean. So it's a little bit more complicated than just dumping it in the ocean. And then when the clean water you get out, very nice, very fresh, how good. There's no ions or salts or anything in it, which actually might not be the best thing if you want to have it for drinking. So sometimes you could add in some extra minerals and stuff. Be delicious. Wow, that was a lot of steps, a lot of things to do to just get the seawater to turn into clean water. So there you have it. That'll be reverse osmosis, and that's how you can turn seawater into fresh water. So you might be wondering, why isn't everyone doing this? That's a good question. There are no plants in New Zealand, but for example, in Qatar, 100% of their water comes from desalination. Oh, so desalination is very helpful if you're like a desert, but you're next to an ocean. A very good idea. Turn that seawater into fresh water. But the main downside to this is it is very expensive. You gotta set up this plant, you gotta set up all the steps that we talked about. A lot of things have to, go into like making and building this plant. And then on top of that, it requires a lot of energy to do all the steps, especially the pressurizing the water. So in Saudi Arabia, it's thought that about half of the oil that they produce goes towards desalination. Half! In Saudi Arabia. I feel like they make a lot of oil. So yeah, it's a big thing. It takes a lot of energy. It's quite expensive. So this just makes it impossible for some people to be able to do it. And on top of just the cost, there's also the environmental impacts. Obviously, if you're using a lot of energy to pressurize the pumps and to do all these things, you're going to have to get this energy from somewhere, and it's probably going to be from like fossil fuels. So you're going to be releasing a lot of CO2 into the air to be running these desalination plants, which is like, not the vibe. Like climate change has kind of got us more into this position of needing more water in the first place, right? So it's a vicious cycle. So there are ways people are trying to combat this by using solar panels at a desalination plant. So using the energy from that to power the plant, which is a very good idea. Nice green energy. And it also is going to end up probably being cheaper than having to keep on paying for the energy. So there's been a lot of research about desalination, especially just even in the past decade, with more advances in like membrane technology and energy recovery systems and different treatment options and using like renewable energy, desalination could become a more viable choice for people if they want to get some water. But at the moment, unless it's really needed, like you're in a desert and there's no other options, it's just not a very efficient way of getting water. So if it comes to it, desalination is an option. It is possible to turn seawater into fresh water. However, it takes a lot of energy and it costs a lot of money and it can be detrimental to the climate. The answer how to get fresh water? Just stop using so much water. Conserving water is much more efficient than desalination. Turn off the tap when you're brushing your teeth. Reduce sprinklers. Reduce, reuse, recycle. Be sensible with water. Yep, that seems like a good way to end it. A positive note, a positive message for the kids. So yeah, conserve water, and you won't have to use desalination.